there's like 68 slides in this presentation, and there's no way we're going to get through all of them, okay? Problem is, I'm not really sure how well versed you are on what is the material that's in Chapter 5, okay? And the material in Chapter 5 is basically material on net present value methods, okay? And how IRR methods, internal rate of return methods, and payback, the payback method, relate to NPV. And it's in that chapter that the authors make a statement that the most reliable measure, okay, that you want to use is NPV. It doesn't mean these other things are not important. And that's why, even though the net present value methodology is sort of the gold standard, we're in a world where a lot of people don't have the financial sophistication. They've been able to do it for years. They use other methods as quick approximations, okay? And IRR is used a lot, especially in financial settings, because you want to look at, well, what are your cost of funds? What's your return going to be? If your return is going to be greater than your cost of funds, you should be adding value to the firm. So Chapter 5 does that. And then Chapter 6 gets into the nitty-gritty, mucky parts, you will, of capital budgeting. Because, and that's where, we got into some of that last week when we did the White Strips case. We'll be getting into it more. We don't have a case due next week, so it'll give you time to do your projects. Or finish off that project for Great Lakes and be ready to do it. We did? Oh, it is Victoria?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it,
That'll be the following week.
I thought there was 1 week. Oh, I might have
We
looked
have a
around.
week between there. Yeah, the 29th.
29th, there's no case? Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I'm glad we're doing Victoria right after this, because 2-week lag, sometimes you forget some of the stuff. But anyway, so you get into a lot of the technical details. And again, I don't know how much of this you get covered during the summer, okay? Michelle sent me a list of questions, and I'm going to try and go over that. She's the only one who sent me stuff. So I'm going to have to kind of wing it. I don't want to, I'd rather go more quickly than not, but I don't want to go so fast that people forget or haven't been exposed to this. Okay. Now, one of the things is, especially in the example coming in Chapter 6, I took that directly out of the text because it's very complicated and you have to have backup for that. Okay. So you can't just look at these slides and try and figure them out. I'm going to stay away from the slideshow as we go through this. I'm not going to talk about one. Okay. So why use net present value? Okay, a lot of good reasons. One of the things we talk about in finance is trying to maximize shareholder value, right? That's where we differ from economists. Economists talk about maximizing a firm's profitability. Finance people talk about maximizing shareholder value, maximizing the value of the firm, okay? And the thing about NPV is you're saying, look, this is adding value. The net present value, if it is positive, says if we do this project, holding everything else constant, the value of this firm is going to be greater, at least from a book standpoint, than if we didn't do it. And I might add, this is very much the kind of stuff that Warren Buffett uses. Okay? Buffett does not get too enamored of whatever's going on in the stock market. It's a very important indicator to him. Okay? But he's mainly concerned, and anytime you hear him speak, and he speaks with some regularity these days on CNBC. It seems like he's on at least once a quarter, if not more often. Then he's always talking about the value of the business. Can we generate, is this a profitable business? And if we're here this year in terms of shareholder value, are we going to be here next year and the year after that are we going to be here? And that's how he looks at things, okay? So he's very much of an NPV kind of guy in the sense of trying to add value. He uses cash flows. Furthermore, we'll talk about payback. Are you guys all familiar with payback? Guys and gals? Okay, men and women? Okay. So we won't have to spend much time on that. Again, trying to get a feel for what we need to do and not having a lot of feedback on this. So it uses all the cash flows. It doesn't truncate them. And it uses the time value of money concept. That a dollar is worth more today than it is a year from now, or that it might be 2 years from now. So all things being considered, you'd rather have cash today rather than waiting for it. NPV, you know how to calculate that? Do I have to go through much of this? Yes, no? Okay. Are you aware of the fact that in Excel, there's an error? The NPV function is not correct in Excel. Yeah, well, we'll go through that because you have to net out the original investment. It's really a present value thing, even though it's called the NPV function. And so, and if you use this in the real world, and a lot of people do, you have to know that. All right. And what happened is they made a mistake in the first version of Excel. And by the time people pointed it out, they already were doing the second version, and so they just said, oh, well, you know, you ought to know this. Wonderful Microsoft. Okay? What's that?
It's called a service pack.
Pardon?
It's not that hard.
Yeah,
Well,
I know.
Well, no,
And-
just
but
have
still.
to change their spreadsheets.
Yeah,
Well, you know,
yeah. I mean, why couldn't they correct it and make it right? They put the burden on you to make sure as a user you have to know it. So, what you have to do, it's pretty, again, most of the stuff is mechanical. Estimate the future cash flows, which again are a real pain. How much, when, estimate the discount rate, estimate your initial cost, and this is your criterion. Okay? We usually, that's the other thing, the norm in doing NPVs is usually, you talk about year 0 as the year the project is initiated. Typically, a lot of your outlays, your capital outlays are in that year, although not all. You know, there's networking capital requirements throughout the life of the project, et cetera. Okay? So, but the bottom line is accepted. If your NPV is greater than 0, don't do it if it's less. And notice here, this is where the error comes in. Okay, so you have to be tricky. If you click on, hopefully this will work. It should work. Yeah, I set up an example so you could actually. Did anybody do that when we were kind of reviewing these? You can click on that Excel spreadsheet. You can see how doing it the incorrect way gives you a different answer than if you do it the correct way. And again, Tila. You know, notice in this correct way, B2 in that formula is this amount. Okay? So you have to be careful if you're going to use Excel. Oh! I didn't want to do that. Sorry. Okay. So that's about all I'm going to say about NPV. Payback, you're all familiar with it? Okay, you know how to handle it? Good. Serious disadvantages. Okay, terrible disadvantages. If you have a long life project with some sort of exponential growth in your returns, you're always going to toss that out the window, even if, you know, it turns out being the greatest thing since sliced bread, because it's all about how fast you pay back your initial investment. You don't give markets time to mature. You know, if you're concerned about liquidity, it's biased towards liquidity, and it's easy to understand because it's easy to calculate. A former colleague of mine, Roy Brooks, who was the Mellon shareholder for many years here, and he's a great guy, he liked talking about discounted payback period. I don't like it at all, okay? I think it's stupid. If you're going to go through the whole idea of discounted cash flows, why not use them all and do an NPV? Okay? So if you're going to go through the trouble of doing the mathematics to get your discounted cash flows, do the NPV, it's already there, okay? And it suffers no drawbacks that discounted payback period does. So that's all I want to say about that. Now, IRR is used a lot. And I'll say this up front. If your cash flows are normal, now what's normal? It basically means that typically you start out and you have outlays. And outlays we usually identify as what kind of numbers? Negative numbers. Okay? So if you have an outlay, I mean, if you think about it, think about cash. An outlay, you're losing cash. So if you think about outlays as being negative and revenues as being positive, okay? As long as your revenue stream and your outlay stream is such that you don't keep switching signs, okay? The more you switch signs, the more problematical IRR becomes. And I'll explain that a little bit as we go get to that, okay? It's easy to understand. I already went through an example of that. You know, if your rate of return is higher than what your cost of capital is or whatever your cost of funding is, you're going to add value. You know, my son, who, when he's going to college, all he cared about was baseball. Okay, he was a baseball player in college. And, but ever since he's gotten out of college, now he's become really kind of a financial kind of guy. And so he talks to me all the time about financial matters. And he and his wife have a co-op apartment, I think it's a 195 square foot apartment, which is probably about half the size of this room, okay, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And and he's been doing pretty well. And so he said, you know, I want to start putting more money in to our mortgage on our co-op. And he's also like the only other person in my family who even cares about the stock market. Okay, and he's got a good. I mean, I think his mortgage rate is around 3 3/4 to 3.5, which is pretty easy. Okay. But does anybody know what the normal, you should know this, what the nominal rate of return is over the long haul in the stock market, the American stocks?
It's 11%.
Yeah, somewhere between 9 and 11, depending upon who you, yeah, so it's between 9 or 11%. And so he's talking about putting all this money, extra money into, you know, into his mortgage. And I said, you know, Mike, you got a nice long-term source of debt. Why do you want to draw that down? Well, you know, I don't like the, yeah. And I said, well, I'll do something for you. I said, how about this? How about if I guarantee that you'll get at least whatever your mortgage rate is, okay? I'll kind of put a floor on that. Instead of putting money into the mortgage, you put it into, you know, like the Vanguard Total Index Fund, okay? Where you should get that 9 to 11%. I mean, we're talking 25, 30 years here that his mortgage is outstanding. And he thought about it and he goes, yeah, well, that sounds like a pretty good deal, right? And I said, yeah, I'm willing to take that bet. After all, it's my son. You know, sooner or later he's gonna get something unless I end up in La La Land for about 5 years in a nursing home. Okay? Well, it's been 1.5 years since I did that. And, you know, every once in a while, because we both keep score, you know, just to make sure. And so again, what's his criteria? Well, what was the criteria he used? Hey, you can get a lot, your return in stocks is better than what you're going to be earning from paying down your mortgage, because you're only getting like 3.5, 3 3/4% on that, when you could be earning 9 to 11% in the stock market. Now, granted, you know, stock market's going to fall. Okay, but 25 years from now, that's what I'm betting on. Okay, So again, I point that out because the IRR is used that way a lot when you're making investment decisions, right? If we think in terms of what's the financing cost, what are we going to get if we invest, and if our rate of return is higher than what the financing cost is, what do you want to do? Yeah, you want to invest if the financing cost is higher than what your return is? It's not worth it, right? Okay, so that's the idea behind the IRR. This damn screen, too, it turns off every 30 seconds, which drives you nuts. And you can, so you've got a minimum acceptance criteria, you've got a ranking criteria. If you lined all these investments up, go with your highest IRR. There's an implicit assumption when you do this that all your future cash flows are going to be reinvested at the internal rate of return. Now, some of the disadvantages, you actually don't know if it doesn't distinguish between investing and financing. Either the IRR, the internal rate of return, may not exist, or you may have multiple IRRs. And if you have mutually exclusive investments, if you do this, you can't do this. Then from an NPV standpoint, you're going to select the one that has the greatest NPV, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have the highest internal rate of return. Okay? And I have a great story in that regard, and I don't know if I should do it now or later. Let me hold off. This is a great example here. Okay? You consider the following project. Well, no, I guess this is not the one I'm thinking about. But this just shows you how you calculate this. The problem with doing a calculation, if you've got, do most of you have either financial calculators or TI-83? Okay? Because if you're really going to do these problems, one of the things that Michelle asked about was doing the problems. And basically either use a spreadsheet, knowing how to use a spreadsheet because it's got an IRR function. You can't really do a payback. I mean, you have to do it manually. But that's real easy to do. And it's got, NPV, and if you do it right, you can do all that on a spreadsheet, or you can do it on a financial calculator. The problem with computing an IRR is that this is a multinomial equation. And if you remember, how many of you had some calculus? Good, good. That's a good sign. Okay. Yeah. But basically, every time a function crosses the x-axis, that is one of the roots of this, multinomial equation. And so what happens is, that's why if you have these crazy cash flows, and they keep switching from being positive to negative and back to positive and negative, IRR breaks down at that point. If it's a normal kind of project where up front you got a lot of negatives, okay, cash outlays, and then after that you have a lot of positives, at the end you may have a sign change because of salvage cost and recoup of investments or whatever. But usually if you got a project like that, typically IRR and NPV are going to give you the same result in terms of do you accept the project or not. So that's one of the key things to remember. But again, you need some computational power in order to solve for the IRR. But and if you work that out, if you calculate, yeah.
Just going back to one of the disadvantages, you put it as an assumption of it, but not as a disadvantage. But the assumption that you would reinvest at that same IRR is almost 0% probability of happening. So
right.
I think IRR is actually not very useful.
Okay. Fair enough.
Because if you have a 19% IRR and you get a cash flow from that project and you can't reinvest it in this project, you're not going to earn 19% necessarily again on that money.
Yeah.
And that assumes that it would. So.
Yeah. Good point. Good point. Okay. And I'm glad you pointed that out. Now, what's a useful tool, and this is just a tool to help kind of get a feel for this, is how a project's NPV, how it is affected by the discount rate. Okay? And in general, the relationship, do I have to blow that up for you to be able to see that?
No.
Okay. Maybe so you can see it okay? Does that help a little bit? Let me get this down. There we go. Okay, is that a little better? So the higher your discount rate, obviously the lower your NPV is going to be. And why is that important? Because when the point at which the net present value switches from a positive number to a negative number, or where it's exactly equal to 0, is what your IRR is for the project. So the 19.44 comes from looking at what happens to the NPV as you apply various discount rates to it. So there's a relationship there. And again, I've got a spreadsheet. You can click on that. It's very easy to use the IRR function. Some of the problems with IRR, you got multiple. I talked about that. I think it's here where we asked a question about are we borrowing or lending? Scale problem. I knew I didn't want to tell my story earlier. And then what's called the timing problem. So here you got an this is an interesting project. Okay? You lend somebody, or let's say you lend somebody $200 now. A year from now, you get $200 back from them, and then you get $800 the following year, and then in the third year, you have to pay them $800. So, should you be a borrower or should you be a lender? You know, if it turns out because of the cash flow issue, there are two routes to the NPV profile. One of them is at 0, and notice if you have a 0 discount rate, you don't care about the time value of money, okay? You lend out 200 here, you get 200 back a year from now, you get another 800, so you get a total of 1,000 back, but then you end up paying 1,000. So is it better to be a lender or the borrower? Which side of that transaction you want to be on? Can't tell from the IRR. The other IRR, which certainly doesn't seem applicable, is that your return is 100%. No way. Okay? No way. And we saw that the actual value, okay, wasn't that the same? Nope, that's different cash flow. Okay, so I can't use that. But there's no way, looking at those numbers, that you're getting 100% rate of return, or that you're being charged 100% interest rate on that investment. Okay. This is not used all that much. Okay. But what it is, if you have these goofy cash flows, you can do this, what's called modified IRR. And you break the problem up into chunks. And then you look at the NPV for the various chunks, and then you put them all together. You understand the difference between mutually exclusive and independent things? A lot of times coming out of statistics, people get those confused. So whenever you have mutually exclusive projects, it means that you're only going to be able to accept one or maybe a couple, but then if you accept those, you cannot accept others. So how do you rank? You know, how do you decide what to invest in, what not to invest in? And this comes up quite a bit of the time, probably more so than you might imagine in corporations. Because you're talking, again, about using this to help you with your corporate strategy. And depending, if you're going to go one way, it's, at least temporarily, it's going to shut off the doors going another way. We're going to get into that in more detail later this semester when we talk about real options. You know, if you do one thing, you may slam the door on the possibility of doing something else, whereas if you do the something else, it may still leave open the possibility in some future period to do the first thing. So, that has to be part of your decision making. And again, since we're talking about strategy leading to resource allocation, they're all linked together. Independent projects. If it's an independent project, whatever your minimum criteria is, if you exceed that, then you're in great shape. This is a scale problem. And it's an interesting question. Would you rather make 100% or 50% on your investments? And when I was just getting out of college, I went to work. I thought it was going to be a permanent job, and then I decided to go to grad school after laboring in the bowels of one of the largest banks in the country. But I went to work for what was then the Continental Illinois Bank, which is in Chicago. The other big bank in Chicago is First National Bank. And First National Bank, if any of you have been to Chicago, they have a very different looking building, if you're familiar with it. And it looks like a couple of, sometimes they call it the praying hands, because if you look at it from a side view, it has a fairly broad base, and then it goes up pointed, so it almost looks like hands stretched out like this. And some of you are nodding, you've seen it. If you look at it full view, there's all these windows, okay? Concrete structure.
Designed by Kenzo Tange?
Pardon me?
Was it designed by Kenzo Tange?
I don't know who the designer was, but
Sounds like one of his designs.
yeah, it could well be. But it turns out that, First National Bank of Chicago was one of the original whiz bang. I mean, you had Northwestern there in Chicago. They were teaching this stuff 40, 50 years ago. So some of their financial analysts, they were doing, they're trying to find out what investments really worked well for the bank. And they came on this one investment, the payback was 100% a year. Okay? They were looking at all these various departments of the bank. They found out, my God, we gave them so much capital, 100% a year was payback. And they said, that's it, man. We found it. All we got to do is, start doing more of that. Well, it turned out that there's a big plaza by the bank, okay? And every summer what they do, everybody sits out there. I don't think they have a fountain, but everybody sits out there, and a lot of pigeons are there and everything. And they have a popcorn stand. And they have bank employees that run this popcorn stand during the summer, okay? And popcorn's pretty cheap, and I'm sure this is, like summer help or part-time help. And it turns out that the number one investment for First National Bank of Chicago is this popcorn stand in the plaza. Well, now, if you put a second popcorn stand up in that plaza, what's going to happen with the rate of return? Yeah, you're not going to get 100%, right? So, I mean, but literally, it was sort of lore within First National Bank that, and of course, people who were in MBAs, they laughed at the MBAs, These guys are so smart, they're going to double our business deal at popcorn stand. So, again, it points out that IRR by itself doesn't address this issue of scale. And it's something that a lot of companies face, okay? Warren Buffett, for example, likes to talk about how he likes to go elephant hunting. For the period of the 2000s, for the most part, he couldn't find any elephants. He finally found one, Burlington Northern Railway, which he bought lock, stock, and barrel. But he had all his cash sloshing around, and he couldn't do anything with it until the crisis hit. And, he made so much money because Goldman Sachs, General Electric, everybody he had more money than I think the Fed and the Treasury combined, because he wasn't in debt spending, okay? And he struck deals with all these companies, and they're still paying off today for the shareholders of Berkshire Hathaway. So again, he's looking at things in terms of NPV, not in terms of IRR. And he just couldn't find anything worthwhile out there. The timing problem, okay? Both of these, and this is where, again, you have to be careful. This is a quick payback project, okay? Notice you get all your money back the first year, and then your returns peter out very quickly. The second case is a slow payback, but when it does pay back, it pays back pretty well. So depending on what your time preference for money is, you're going to prefer one of those options over the other. In other words, there's not a consistent which is the best project to undertake, okay? At very high discount rates, okay? At very high discount rates, I'm over here, discount rate is along this axis. At very high discount rates, project A is preferred because you get your cash back right away. I mean, that's the simplicity of it. At low discount rates, all right, which is a period we're in now, it turns out that second project is preferred. And this point right here is what we call a crossover rate, okay? That at an IRR of 10.55%, or a discount rate of, I should say, 10.55%, you're indifferent between those two projects. But on either side of that, you're not indifferent. One project is considered to be better than the other, okay? I won't get into all of this. I mean, you can look at the mathematics. I think you'll understand that. And I already talked about this, where NPV generally will give you the same decision except for these non-conventional cash flows or mutually exclusive projects. So how are we doing? Does that make sense? Follow it? Okay, good. Now, I want to skip past this. Generally, most corporations use both. They use both just as a check on each other. Capital rationing. It happens a lot. Boards of directors, I don't know about private equity. I don't have as much of a history of private equity. But boards of directors, usually they feel this is one of those things, it's a board-level decision. How much are we going to spend on capital? And so, and of course, because of that, everybody has these very optimistic projections that they make for their projects. But even with those optimistic projections, you end up with at least what is called soft rationing. Hard rationing is when you've got debt holders, banks, other creditors who say, we're just not going to lend you any more than this. So that's hard rationing. But anytime when you end up in a rationing situation, even with NPV, it complicates how your analysis goes. All right? And again, NPV, we're trying to maximize shareholder value. So this profitability index is based on NPV. It's an offshoot of NPV that you use when you get into a rationing situation. Okay? And the bottom line is that last bullet point. The highest weighted profitability index can indicate which projects, if you have multiple projects, to select. And how do you calculate the profitability index? Well, it's the total present value of all those cash flows, okay? So it's basically year 1 through year K of the project. And then instead of subtracting off your initial investment, you divide it by it. So it's very similar to the NPV process, okay? You just manipulate, notice you've got present value of future flows and this should be at present value if you assume a 0-year investment. And as long as PI is greater than 1, it's saying you're adding value, right? Because the numerator is greater than the denominator. If it's less than 1, it's not worth it. Key thing if we're in rationing is how do you rank all the projects? And this is an example that kind of indicate, the first part was just calculation of the NPVs. You can check all this using, again, either your financial calculator or a spreadsheet to get the present value of these cash flows. Now notice you're taking the 30 and the 35, and you're not taking the negative 10. Okay, you're just taking the 30 and the 35. Same thing with the plus 20 and the plus 5. Turn that on, it's there, 10 seconds. Drives me nuts. So what you have your initial investment, you have your present value, and so you just take the present value of your future cash flows divided by the value of the investment, and you get your profitability index. So obviously, B has the highest profitability here, okay? Now, if you have $10 to spend, if you accept project A, your profitability index is 2.1. If you accept projects B and C, okay, then it turns out, since they're evenly weighted in terms of the initial investment, your profitability index would be 2.8. So projects B and C are preferred over A. But now, if you had $15 to spend, if you do B and C, you don't have enough to finance A. And a return on cash is 0. So you've got some lost opportunity if you were to choose B and C. So it turns out